I've been up here before reading other people's sermons. I guess it's part of my drama training or something or another like that. And so that's what you've kind of come to expect of me. This morning is a little special because the Sunday Service Committee decided that today would be a day to invite me to come in and read a sermon. And Lisa, who's on the Sunday Service Committee, was given the job of being lay leader and finding the sermon. And so she went hunting. And she hunted. And she did not find anything that she liked from with the theme that she wanted to deal with today. So she started kind of noodling on her own. And guess what? The sermon I'm going to give you today, that I'm going to read today, was written by Lisa. And so I asked her, I said, "You wrote the sermon. Why aren't you giving it?" And she said, "I don't want to be up there the entire service this Sunday." So I said, okay, I'm more than happy to do it. So as I read today, think of Lisa because these are her words. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "You have learned that they were told, 'Love your neighbor, hate your enemy.' But what I tell you is this, love your enemies and pray for your prosecutors, only so that you can be children of the Heavenly Father, who makes the sun rise on the good and bad alike, and sends the rain on the honest and dishonest." That's from Matthew 5:43 to 46. Now, after the recent elections, many of us were left with a legitimate anger and genuine fear. And I imagine quite a few of you have reacted with resistance or even alarm when you saw the theme of today's service, loving our enemies. And then the sermon starts off with a quote from the Bible. Well, this is an important topic that we need to think about right now, especially now. And as Richard Rohr, an activist Catholic priest, said, love is perhaps the last thing anyone wants to be reminded of in these days following the election in the United States. Yet our resistance to love is precisely why we need to talk about it. We have strayed so far from love, and yet it is the essence of who we are and how we are called to treat one another. So, let's be clear. Loving your enemy doesn't mean condoning or ignoring unacceptable behavior. As the Reverend Darcy Lane, who is a UU minister from Ithaca, New York, said in her sermon, "Love Your Enemy," quote, "Love doesn't mean letting people walk all over you. Monstrous behavior absolutely has to be named, and we have to create limits for what behavior is allowed." And she asks then, can we simultaneously oppose monstrous behavior and have compassion and love for the broken being underneath that behavior? Unquote. So hang in there with me while I discuss this difficult concept of loving our enemies. Martin Luther King preached in 1957 that Jesus' words on loving our enemies, quote, "glitter in our eyes with a new urgency. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, this command is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. Yes, it is love that will save our world and our civilization. Love even for enemies." End quote. The Dalai Lama said, "Genuine compassion is based on the recognition that others have the right to happiness just like yourself. And therefore, even your enemy is a human being with the same wish for happiness as you, and the same right to happiness as you. A sense of concern developed on this basis is what we call compassion. It extends to everyone, irrespective of whether that person's attitude toward you is hostile or friendly. Now, we know how divided this country is, even the world. Polarized could have been named the word of the year. Mainstream culture, fueled by everyone's access to social media, seems to accept that anyone who does something we don't like is our enemy. And it's okay to insult them or to bully them. And even if we don't go that far, many of us probably carry not only despair, but feelings bordering on hate in our hearts. And some of us may even harbor dark secrets about wanting terrible things to happen to leaders we disagree with. Too many snickers there. But what would happen if we could channel some of our hate, our intense dislike, into even a little bit of love and compassion? Why should we even try not to hate the hate groups? First answer is based in our own UUism. Reverend Lane suggests, I believe it falls to us not only as people of faith, but as people of this particular community who have championed universalism for over 200 years, to remember a different way of being in the world, to be leaders and role models in spreading the good news about the inherent worth and dignity of every person, even the people we love to hate. That darned first principle. And love is at the foundation of the new shared value statement that the UUA recently developed or adopted. Our new values and covenant states that love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared thoughts through the spiritual discipline of love. So, Jesus, Martin Luther King, the Dalai Lama, a Catholic priest, and the UUA agree that practicing love toward all is the right thing to do. The notion of loving our enemies is pretty ecumenically unanimous. But is it realistic? In Martin Luther King's sermon about loving your enemies, he observed, quote, many people have said that this command of Jesus is just additional proof that he was an impractical idealist who never quite came down to earth. But far from being an impractical idealist, Jesus has become a practical realist. End quote. So what does King mean? How is loving our enemy a practical thing to attempt? Some have suggested that while loving our enemies may be only an aspirational goal, striving toward it may actually benefit us as individuals and help us to develop spiritually. Now, how might this be? First, although we may experience a certain comforting sense of unity when we band together against a common enemy, this focus may detract from self-examination. As Reverend Lane points out, if we only focus on our enemies and their heinous nature, that allows us to, quote, finally have someone to carry that part of our own shadow. It makes us feel clean and righteous to externalize our shadow onto the other. If a racist looks like all those images of white men holding tiki torches shouting hateful things, we can all focus on how to stop them. If they are the enemy, I don't have to struggle with my own shadow, my own white privilege, my participation in white supremacy culture. unquote. Martin Luther King gave another reason why loving our enemies is good for us. Hate can destroy the hater. He said, hate destroys the very structure of the personality of the hater. When you start hating anybody, it destroys the very center of your creative response to life and to the universe. So love everybody. Hate at any point is a cancer that gnaws away at the vital center of your life and your existence. As I said earlier, loving our enemies does not mean we step aside and let them run rampant. We can try to love our enemies, yet fight against their hateful actions. Many of us believe that we will have a lot of fights on our hands in the next few years. Reverend Rebecca Parker, a United Methodist minister, reminds us that love, not hate, will ultimately sustain us in these fights. She tells us that our work for justice must be grounded in more than our outrage or grief to be sustainable or sustaining. Instead, she encourages our resistance to be grounded in a, quote, deep affirmation of life's goodness and in celebration of life's beauty. We can't affirm life's goodness if we're focused on how much we hate our enemy. We can't celebrate life's beauty if hate is eating away our soul, unquote. We've heard now that we should love our enemies because of our UUA principles and values, and that focusing our energy on hating our enemies detracts from examining our own potential contributions to the world's problems, that hate can destroy our soul, and that our fight for justice will burn out if it's mainly fueled by hate and anger. But how do we go about tackling this seemingly impossible charge of loving our enemies? What is realistic for us to try to do? As Reverend Lane confessed, I find it hard even to hold those two concepts in my heart at the same time, enemy and love. This is going to take intention and awareness. Could we start by attempting to at least dial back our judgment a bit, as Reverend Margot suggested a few Sundays ago? In her sermon, she told us about a woman who was a strong and bitter opponent of President Biden. A look into the reasons for her opposition, however, revealed she had been duped into believing that Biden would increase her taxes to the point where she would lose her house, a vital asset for her. She wasn't an evil person, just a very gullible one who was very scared. And then there's the example of Christian Picciolini. Try that name twice. Say it 10 times, right? Christian Picciolini, who joined a Chicago skinhead white supremacist group at 14, and by 16 was the group's leader. He went on to head a supremacist punk band and then a hate rock band that performed internationally. Today, however, he devotes his life to helping people leave extremist groups. He founded the Free Radicals Project, a global organization that works to prevent extremism and help people disengage from hate movements. He remembers that he was a lonely kid who, when someone from the skinheads first approached him, it was the first time in his life he felt like someone was paying attention to him. Picciolini believes that people join hate groups because they feel marginalized and want to belong, and the hate groups welcome them and bring them in. It's his opinion, quote, the secret to stopping people from becoming extremists is to understand, and in most cases they're not monsters, they're broken human beings doing monstrous things. If we can look at our enemies through that lens, separating the person from their actions, we may be able to have more compassion for them. In addition to trying to dial back our judgment, could we try having a dialogue with someone we disagree with and whose ideas truly offend us? This admittedly is very challenging. Not only could help us see a person whose this, which is admittedly very challenging, not only could help us to see a person behind these opinions, but just might, leave an impression on that person. An NPR ran a story on Megan Phelps Roper, who grew up in the Westboro Baptist Church, the one whose people show up at funerals with hateful signs. She eventually left the church, and with it her family. And why? When she began running the Westboro Twitter account, many Twitter users responded angrily to her, but others seemed sincerely interested in opening a dialogue. And it was through these dialogues she began to truly question the church's hateful teachings. One way we might be able to cultivate some compassion for our enemies and ourselves is turning to Buddhist wisdom, and specifically the Buddhist practice of metta-meditation. Most of you familiar with it? Some of you? Okay. It involves wishing positive feelings like happiness toward ourselves and others. And in the most common version of metta practice, the wishes of goodwill are offered first to ourselves, and then in succession to someone we love, and then someone we consider a difficult person, and finally to all beings everywhere. It's important to make the process incremental. Thus, the process starts with ourselves, then moves on to a being we consider beloved, such as a mentor, a child, a pet. Only when we're ready do we work up to including a more difficult person. Buddhist teacher Melvin Escobar compares the practice of metta to lifting weights. If we begin with a weight that's too heavy for us, we might end up hurt or give up because of the aversion and despair that may arise. If we do not start slow, we may or may not ever achieve the goal of sincerely wanting our enemies to find personal happiness. I'd like to conclude with a quote from Reverend Lane. The culture around us shows us day after day what happens when we lash out at our enemies with hate. What happens when we love only our neighbors and hate our enemies? Perhaps it's time to break that cycle of retribution and violence and turn instead to the slow, vulnerable work of cultivating compassion. We are called to trust that at the bottom stream of reality is love. To enter that stream, to let love fill our hearts and let it flow out to friend and enemy alike. Let us step into that stream as our prayer for one another and for the world. Blessed be.